Good morning, Admiral. The words fell into the center of my wedding reception like a stone breaking the surface of still water. Every conversation cut off mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as heads turned in unison. I remember the subtle rustle of fabric, dozens of guests shifting at once, all trying to understand who the man in the tailored navy suit was addressing. He stood tall, posture firm, shoulders squared, his eyes locked directly on me, and then he raised his hand in a crisp salute. For a brief moment, no one moved, not even me. Across the room, I caught sight of Harold, my soon-to-be father-in-law. The color drained from his face. The confidence he had been wearing all afternoon dissolved instantly, his jaw slackening as though whatever held it steady had just been cut loose. But that moment, that exact moment, didn't begin there. It had started long before the reception, long before Harold's words sliced through me in front of a room full of people I was about to call family. It began years earlier, with the decision I made to live a quieter life. I have never been someone who chased attention. After I retired, I settled into a small coastal town in Virginia, not far from Norfolk. It was the kind of place where mornings began with the distant cries of seagulls, and evenings ended with neighbors offering casual waves from their porches. There was nothing extravagant about it. It was steady, familiar, honest, exactly the kind of life I wanted. My house reflected that choice. Simple white siding, a narrow porch out front, and a small garden I cared for myself. In the summers, I grew tomatoes. In the fall, I trimmed hedges and cleared leaves. By the front door, I kept a small American flag, not out of habit, but out of respect. In that town, I was simply Evelyn, not ma'am, not commander, not admiral, just Evelyn. And that simplicity suited me perfectly. I met Richard at a local community fundraiser, one of those gatherings where everyone brings a dish and at least one casserole ends up burnt. I had made lemon bars. He arrived with store-bought cookies and apologized for them before anyone even tried one. He was kind in a quiet, genuine way that feels rare. Not loud, not performative, just present. We spoke for nearly an hour that evening, about books, about the ocean, about how strange it feels to begin again later in life. He told me he had been widowed for 5 years. I told him I understood loss. Neither of us pressed for details. That was how it started. Richard never pushed me about my past. He knew I had worked in government, and that seemed enough for him. Maybe it was a generational thing. He understood that not everything needs to be spoken aloud. Or maybe he simply trusted me enough not to ask. Either way, I was grateful, because the truth was, I didn't want to be defined by what I had been. I wanted to be known for who I was now. His family, however, operated differently. They were respectable, well-established, the sort of people who valued their name and expected others to recognize it. His father, Harold, had spent decades in federal contracting. He carried himself like a man who believed he had earned every ounce of his success and deserved acknowledgement for it. The first time we met, his handshake was firm, but his eyes assessed me in a way that felt less like greeting and more like evaluation. "Richard tells me you've had a quiet career," he said. I smiled politely. "You could say that." He nodded, though something in his expression lingered. Curiosity, perhaps, or doubt. It was a look I had seen many times before. Over the following months, as Richard and I grew closer, Harold's tone didn't soften. He wasn't openly rude, not at first, but there were remarks, subtle ones, carefully worded so they could be dismissed if challenged. Comments about expectations, about background, about what a person brings into a family. I let them pass. At my age, you learn which confrontations are worth your energy and which are not. Richard either didn't see it fully or chose not to confront it. He loved his father, and Harold, for his part, was not a man accustomed to being questioned. So I chose peace. When Richard proposed, it was simple. We were sitting on my porch watching the sun sink into the water. He pulled out a small box and said, "I don't want to spend whatever time I have left without you." No audience, no spectacle, just honesty. I said yes. Wedding planning brought our families together more often, and that was when the tension became harder to ignore. Harold's questions grew sharper, more direct. He wanted details, specifics, something he could measure, something he could categorize. What exactly did you do? Was it administrative work? And your pension, is it sufficient? I answered carefully, always respectfully, but never in the way he wanted. One afternoon, during a planning lunch, he leaned back and said, "Marriage isn't just about companionship, it's about reputation." "I agree," I told him calmly. He nodded, then added, "I just want to make sure my son isn't settling." The table fell quiet. Richard shifted, but I placed a hand over his. "It's all right," I said. Not because it didn't matter, but because I had spent a lifetime understanding that people often reveal themselves more clearly than they intend. Still, I could feel it building. The quiet judgment, the assumptions, the way he had already decided who I was without ever truly knowing me. I could have told them everything, my career, my rank, my history. I could have ended the questions before they fully formed, but that wouldn't have changed who they were, and it wouldn't have shown me who they truly were either. So I said nothing, and I waited, because respect that depends on titles is not respect at all. By the week of the wedding, I had come to understand something most people eventually learn. Not every family welcomes change, even when they call it happiness. We were to be married in a small Episcopal church by the water. Nothing elaborate, just fresh flowers, a modest reception, and people who mattered. That was all I wanted. But Harold had no intention of making things easy. 3 days before the wedding, we had dinner at his house. Everything looked perfect on the surface, the table set carefully, the food prepared with care, but tension sat quietly beneath it all. Halfway through the meal, Harold turned to me again. "What was your title exactly?" "I worked in naval operations," I answered. "That's not really a title," he said. "No," I replied calmly, "it isn't." He laughed softly, as if confirming something. The conversation continued, but the meaning behind his words lingered. Later, outside on the patio, Richard apologized. He asked gently about the parts of my life I didn't share. "I'll tell you," I said, "in my own time." He accepted that. That was who he was. The night before the wedding, I sat alone in my room, looking at something I hadn't worn in years. I opened the box, studied it for a long moment, then closed it again. Not yet, because timing matters. On the morning of the wedding, I awoke before dawn. Old habits never leave entirely. The house was quiet, the air soft with early light. I knew, even then, this would be a day I would carry with me, not because of flowers or music, but because of what it would reveal. The ceremony itself was beautiful, simple, honest. Richard's voice trembled during his vows. Mine did not, though I felt every word. For a while, it felt like peace might hold. At the reception, the room filled with warmth, laughter, conversations, music. For a time, I allowed myself to believe Harold would let the day pass without incident. Then came the speeches. Richard spoke first. His words were sincere, filled with gratitude. He spoke of love not as something new, but as something deeper when found later in life. Then Harold stood. At first, his tone was polished, controlled, but slowly it shifted. He spoke of concern, of questions, of uncertainty, and then in front of everyone he said what he truly believed, that I was a mystery, that I had hidden things, that his son might be too trusting, that perhaps I had built a life that only sounded important. The room fell silent.
Richard stood, telling him to stop, but Harold continued, and when he finished, the silence that followed carried weight. I rose slowly, not with anger, not with drama, just calm. You are entitled to your opinions, but not to invent my life. He challenged me to explain myself. I didn't, and that unsettled him more than anything else. Then the doors opened. A man entered, tall, composed, followed by two others at a distance. The room shifted without understanding why. I recognized him immediately. Rear Admiral Thomas Whitaker. He walked directly towards me, stopping just in front of where I stood. Then he saluted. "Good morning, Admiral." The room went completely still. I returned the salute. "Good morning, Tom." Everything changed in that moment. Harold's confidence disappeared entirely. He understood now. Whitaker spoke briefly, then stepped aside. Richard stood beside me, stunned but not angry. "I was going to tell you," I said. "I know," he replied. Harold approached, shaken. If I had known, I stopped him gently. "If you had known," I said, "you would have treated me differently." He hesitated, then admitted it. And that, I told him, was exactly why I never said anything. The room absorbed that.
Not just Harold, everyone. Because what I had said wasn't complicated, but it was undeniable. Whitaker folded his hands behind his back, his posture relaxed but precise. "Admiral Carter," he said, turning slightly toward the room, "served with distinction for over 3 decades. She commanded operations most people in this room will never hear about, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives." I felt a flicker of discomfort at that. I had never been one for public praise. "Tom?" I said, quietly. He inclined his head, just stating facts. Then he added more gently, "Facts that should have been recognized long before today." Harold flinched. I took a slow breath. This was the moment I realized, not the salute, not the revelation, but what came after. This was where things could turn into something bitter or something better. I looked around the room, at the guests who had watched in silence, at Diane who looked ashamed, at Marianne who looked thoughtful, at Richard who looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, and yet somehow more clearly than ever, and finally back at Harold. His shoulders had lowered, his certainty was gone. In its place was something I hadn't seen before. Humility. "I didn't keep my past a secret to deceive anyone," I said, my voice calm but steady enough to carry. "I kept it private because I wanted to live the rest of my life as a person, not as a rank." No one interrupted. "I've spent years in rooms where titles mattered, where authority had to be clear, where decisions had consequences that couldn't be undone." I paused. "But this," I gestured lightly around the room, "this was supposed to be different." My gaze settled on Harold again. This was supposed to be about family. Harold's eyes dropped. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out quietly, not polished, not practiced, just real. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Diane moved first. She stepped toward me, her eyes filled with something soft and regretful. "Evelyn," she said, "I'm so sorry. I should have said something." I reached out and touched her hand. "You're saying it now." That seemed to matter to her. Richard finally exhaled a breath he'd been holding far too long. "Well," he said with a faint disbelieving smile, "I guess I should have asked a few more questions." A light ripple of laughter moved through the room, not mocking, not sharp, but relieved. The tension cracked, just a little. Whitaker stepped back slightly, his role in the moment complete. "I'll leave you to your celebration," he said. I nodded. "Thank you for coming." He gave me one last respectful look. "Always, Admiral." Then he turned and walked back through the room, the quiet authority he carried leaving a different kind of silence behind him.
As the doors closed, the weight in the room shifted again. Not gone, but changed. What had been humiliation was now something else. Reckoning, understanding, and perhaps the beginning of something better. Harold remained where he stood, still processing. Then, slowly, almost as if it cost him something, he took another step toward me. This time he didn't stop, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked at me not as someone to evaluate, but as someone he needed to understand. For a while, after the doors closed behind Admiral Whitaker, no one seemed quite sure what to do next. The music had stopped at some point, I hadn't even noticed when, and the trio in the corner sat quietly with their instruments resting in their laps, waiting for someone to signal that it was all right to begin again. Glasses remained half-raised, conversations hung unfinished. Moments like that don't resolve all at once. They settle slowly, like dust after something has been shaken loose. Richard was still standing beside me, his hand wrapped firmly around mine now, as if he needed to anchor himself to something steady. "You were a Navy admiral," he said quietly. I nodded. Yes. He let out a soft breath, not quite a laugh. That's not exactly small detail. No, I agreed, it isn't. He studied my face, searching not for answers, I realized, but for reassurance. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. There was no accusation in it, just hurt and curiosity. I turned slightly so we were facing each other fully, even though the room was still watching. "Because I wanted you to see me," I said, "not what I used to be."
His brow furrowed. "I do see you." "I know," I said gently, "but I needed to know that first." That seemed to settle something in him. He nodded slowly. "You're right." And then, after a pause, he added, "I just wish I had known what you were carrying." That word stayed with me. Carrying. Because that's what a life like mine becomes eventually. Not a badge, not a title, a weight. Around us, the room began to stir again. Not loudly, not abruptly, but carefully. A few guests resumed quiet conversations. Chairs shifted. Someone signaled to the musicians, and soft piano notes began to fill the space again, gentle and unobtrusive. But the atmosphere had changed. People were looking at me differently now, not just with curiosity, with respect, and in some cases with a kind of distance that hadn't been there before. That, more than anything, was what I had always tried to avoid. Diane approached again, this time more composed. "Evelyn," she said, "I can't imagine the responsibility you must have carried all those years." I smiled faintly. It wasn't something I carried alone. She nodded, though I wasn't sure she fully understood. Few people outside that world ever do. Marianne stepped forward next. "I feel like I owe you an apology too," she said. "For what?" "For not seeing what was happening. Or maybe seeing it and not saying anything." I considered that. Then I shook my head. "You're not responsible for someone else's behavior." She gave a small, thoughtful nod. "I still wish I had said something," she admitted. "That's fair," I said. And it was. Across the room, I saw Harold still standing near his chair. He hadn't moved much since the moment everything changed. His glass sat untouched in his hand. He wasn't looking at me now, he was looking down. I had seen that posture before, too. Not in men who had been defeated, but in men who had just realized they had been wrong. There's a difference. Defeat closes a man. Understanding opens him. After a few minutes, he finally walked toward us, not with his usual confidence, not with that careful, measured authority he carried like a second skin, just slowly. When he reached us, he didn't speak right away. He set his glass down on the nearest table, cleared his throat, then looked at me directly. "I owe you an apology," he said. The room quieted again, not completely, but enough that those closest could hear. "I spoke out of turn," he continued, "and out of assumption." I held his gaze. "Yes," I said. He didn't flinch. "I judged you based on what I didn't know," he went on, "and instead of asking with respect, I pushed. I made it public when it should have remained private." There was no defensiveness in his voice now, no justification, just acknowledgement. "That matters more than most people realize." "I appreciate you saying that," I told him. He nodded once. Then, after a pause, he added, "If I had known who you were—" I shook my head gently. "That's not the point." He stopped, and for the first time I saw him really listening. "The problem isn't that you didn't know my rank," I said. "The problem is that you believed respect should depend on it." The words were quiet, but they carried. He absorbed that slowly. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "You're right." That couldn't have been easy for him. Men like Harold build their lives on certainty. Admitting fault isn't just uncomfortable, it's disorienting. "I spent my entire career in a system where rank mattered," I continued. "It had to. People needed to know who was responsible, who made decisions, who answered for outcomes." He nodded slightly. "But outside of that system," I said, "rank is just a word. It doesn't define who a person is." I let that sit for a moment. "Character does." Harold looked down again, then back up. "And I misjudged yours," he said. "Yes," I replied. There was no need to soften it. "Truth doesn't require decoration," he exhaled slowly. "I won't pretend I can undo what I said," he admitted, "but I would like the chance to do better." That, more than the apology itself, told me something had shifted, because doing better requires more than regret. It requires change. I studied him for a moment, then I nodded. That's all anyone can ask. There was a small release in the room after that, not dramatic but real. Conversations resumed more naturally. The music picked up a little. Someone laughed at something across the room and it didn't feel out of place anymore. Richard squeezed my hand. "You handled that better than I would have," he said quietly. I smiled. "That's why you married me." He chuckled softly, "Among other reasons." As the afternoon continued, people approached me one by one. Some offered congratulations, some asked respectful questions about my service, others simply shook my hand and said nothing at all. I answered what I chose to answer and left the rest where it belonged, in the past. But through it all, one thing remained clear in my mind. Respect that arrives only after revelation is not the same as respect that exists from the beginning. And yet, sometimes it's the only kind people are capable of at first. What matters is whether they learn to offer it without conditions. As I looked around the room at Richard, at Diane, at Marianne, and even at Harold, now speaking more quietly than I had ever seen him, I realized something I hadn't expected. This day hadn't just revealed who I was, it had revealed who they were, and more importantly, who they might still become. By the time the sun had begun to lower over the marina, the reception had softened into something quieter and more honest than it had been all afternoon. The shock had worn off, the whispers had thinned. People were no longer looking at me with that startled, searching expression they'd had after Admiral Whitaker's salute. They were looking at me more normally now, though perhaps with a little more care than before. I was grateful for that. I had no desire to spend the rest of my wedding day as a spectacle. Richard and I had managed one slow dance, just one. The band was playing an old standard, something from the 60s, warm and familiar, and we moved carefully across the floor with the kind of restraint that comes from years, not from lack of feeling. His hand rested lightly at my back. My head was near his shoulder. Neither of us spoke for the first minute or so. Finally, he said, "I keep replaying the whole day in my mind." "That's usually a sign of shock," I said. He gave a quiet laugh. "That obvious?" "A little." We kept moving. Then he said more seriously, "I'm not upset that you were an admiral." "I certainly hope not." That brought another small laugh from him. "I'm upset," he said, "that you felt you had to carry that alone."
I drew back just enough to see his face. It wasn't about carrying it alone. Then what was it about? I took a breath. It was about leaving it where it belonged. He studied me, listening. When you spend years in command, I said, people stop seeing the person and start seeing the structure around her, the rank, the authority, the expectations. Even after retirement, it follows you. People either stiffen around you or perform for you. I didn't want that with you. And you thought telling me would change that? I didn't know, I said honestly, but I knew I didn't want to begin our life together inside a title I had already spent a lifetime carrying. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. I can understand that. I smiled a little. You don't have to understand all of it. I know, he said, but I'd like to understand more than I did this morning. That touched me. So I rested my head against his shoulder again and let the music carry us the rest of the way through the song. When it ended, he kissed my temple and said, "Whatever you tell me from here on out, tell me because you want to, not because anyone forced the moment." That was Richard all over. A decent man in an indecent moment, still trying to make room for grace. A little later, after coffee had been served and the cake had been cut, I stepped outside to the club's back terrace for air. The evening was cool and clear. The water beyond the railing had turned a deep blue-gray, and boat masts rocked gently in the slips below. From inside came the softened sound of conversation and silverware, blurred now by glass and distance. I stood there for a minute by myself, one hand resting on the railing, letting the quiet settle my nerves. "I thought I might find you out here." I turned. Harold stood in the open doorway. For once, he did not look like a man entering a room he expected to control. He looked older than he had that morning, not frail, just stripped of some invisible armor. I didn't speak. I simply waited. He came a few steps closer, then stopped at what felt like a respectful distance. "I won't keep you long," he said. "That would be appreciated." He nodded, accepting that. For a moment, he looked out at the water instead of at me. "I've spent most of my life believing I could read people quickly," he said. "It served me well in business, or so I told myself." I folded my hands loosely in front of me. "And today?" He gave a humorous little smile. "Today, I found out there's a difference between reading people and sorting them." That was better than I expected from him. He turned to me then, his expression plain, unguarded. "I was cruel to you." "Yes," I said. "I embarrassed my son." "Yes." "I embarrassed myself." I let that sit for a beat. "Also, yes." For the first time all day, something almost like humility passed between us without resistance. It didn't fix anything, but it cleared the air. He slipped one hand into his pocket and exhaled slowly. "I've been trying to understand why I reacted to you the way I did." "Have you?" "I think so." He looked down briefly, then back at me. "You made me feel irrelevant." That surprised me, not because it was impossible, but because he admitted it. I said nothing, and he went on. "Richard listens to you in a way he stopped listening to me years ago, not out of disrespect, just because he trusts you, and the less you explained yourself, the more I felt shut out. I told myself I was protecting him, but the truth is, I didn't like not being the one with authority. There it was. Not class anxiety, not suspicion, not even disapproval at the core of it. Fear. The ordinary fear of a man aging out of the role he had built his identity around.
I had seen versions of that fear before, in officers facing retirement, in politicians after elections, in men who mistake usefulness for control and then don't know who they are without it. "It's a hard thing," I said quietly, "to realize the people you love no longer need your permission to build their lives." He nodded harder than I expected. The honesty in that softened me more than the apology itself had. Harold looked toward the water again. "My father was the same sort of man," he said, "maybe harder. In his house, respect meant obedience. You didn't question him, you didn't withhold information, you certainly didn't let him feel small. "And now?" I asked. He gave a tired smile. "Now, I suppose I handed that legacy right down the line without thinking about it." I leaned back lightly against the railing. "That's how it usually happens." He looked at me then, genuinely curious. "Why didn't you destroy me in there?" It was such a blunt question that I almost smiled. "I'm sorry." "You could have," he said. "The moment Whitaker saluted you, you could have humiliated me in front of everyone, given a speech, told them exactly who I was, exactly what I'd done. I think they already saw." He winced because he knew it was true. "But that's not an answer," he said. "No," I replied, "it isn't." I looked past him for a moment through the window where I could see Richard inside speaking quietly with Diane. Then I looked back at Harold. "Revenge is satisfying for about 5 minutes," I said. "After that, you still have to live with yourself." He frowned slightly, listening. "I learned a long time ago that correction and humiliation are not the same thing. One teaches, the other only spreads damage." The wind shifted lightly across the terrace. Somewhere below us, halyards tapped softly against a mast. Harold's eyes lowered. "I don't know if I've done much teaching in my life." "Not today," I said. A corner of his mouth twitched despite himself. "Fair enough." We stood there in silence for a moment, then he said more quietly, "I was wrong about you, but worse than that, I was wrong in front of people I love. My wife, my daughter, my son." He swallowed. "I don't want that to be the last lesson they take from me." That mattered, because by then I understood what this conversation really was. Not an attempt to erase his shame, not even a plea for forgiveness. It was the first time, perhaps in years, that Harold was speaking without performing. "You can't undo today," I said, "but you can decide what kind of man you'll be tomorrow." He nodded once, firmly. Then, after a pause, he said, "I'd like the chance to earn your trust, not because of your rank, because of what you showed me today." That was the closest thing to wisdom I had heard from him. I considered him carefully. Trust at my age is not handed out because someone asks politely, but neither is it withheld forever if change is real. "You can start," I said, "by speaking to Richard honestly, not as a father giving instruction, as a man admitting fault. I can do that. And to Diane," I added, "she's been smoothing over your sharp edges for years." His face shifted. A little shame, a little recognition. "Yes," he said, "you're right. I usually am." That actually drew a short laugh out of him. Not much, but enough to sound human. He straightened then, not stiffly, but with intention. "For what it's worth, Evelyn, your restraint today said more about your character than any title ever could." I met his eyes. "That," I said, "is the first truly respectful thing you've said to me." He accepted that without protest. Then he gave me a small nod and stepped back toward the doorway. Before he went inside, he turned once more. "I am glad my son married you." There was no polish in it, no strategy, just truth. And because of that, I believed him. After he left, I remained on the terrace for another minute, listening to the water and the muffled warmth of the reception behind me. I thought about the strange shape the day had taken, how humiliation had turned into revelation, and revelation into something quieter and harder to earn. Not victory, not exactly. Something better. Perspective. When I went back inside, Richard looked up immediately and crossed the room to me. "You all right?" he asked. "I am now," I said. He glanced toward the hall, where Harold had disappeared a moment earlier. "Did he come out here?" "Yes." And I slipped my hand into his. "And I think," I said, "your father may finally be ready to grow up." Richard stared at me for half a second, then laughed. Really laughed, for the first time all day. And that, more than the salute, more than the shocked silence, more than Harold's apology, felt like the first clear sign that the worst of the day was behind us. By the time the evening began to wind down, the reception had transformed into something I hadn't expected when the day began. It was quieter, warmer, more honest.
The kind of gathering where people leaned in closer when they spoke, where laughter came easier, and where whatever had been shaken loose earlier in the day had settled into something more grounded. The band played softer now. The sky outside had darkened into a deep navy, the kind that reflects faintly off the water, like memory rather than light. Guests were beginning to say their goodbyes. Lingering hugs, slow handshakes, promises to call, to visit, to stay in touch. At our age, you learn that goodbyes are never casual, they carry weight. Richard and I stood near the entrance, thanking people as they left. "You gave us quite a story to remember," one of the older gentlemen said to me with a small smile. "I wasn't aiming for that," I replied. He chuckled. "The best stories never are." Another woman squeezed my hand gently. "You handled yourself with such grace." "Thank you," I said, but I knew grace had not been something I woke up with that morning. It had been built over years through discipline, restraint, and the understanding that not every battle deserves to be fought in the moment it appears. Sometimes the most powerful response is patience. Diane approached us once the last of the guests had drifted out. She looked tired, but lighter than she had earlier. "I don't think I've ever experienced a day quite like this," she said. "I hope that's not a complaint," I replied gently. She smiled. "No, I think it's a lesson." She turned to Richard, touching his arm briefly, then looked back at me. "I've spent many years keeping peace in this family," she said. "Sometimes that meant staying quiet when I shouldn't have." I listened. "That changes today," she added. There was a quiet strength in her voice I hadn't heard before, and I believed her. A few minutes later, Harold joined us, not at the head of the room, not with an audience, just beside us. He cleared his throat lightly. "Most of the staff is beginning to clean up," he said. "I've already spoken to the manager about the final arrangements." It was such an ordinary statement that for a moment I almost smiled, because it wasn't about control, it was about contribution. A small shift, but a real one. Then he turned to Richard. "I owe you something as well," he said. Richard looked at him carefully. "You do?" Harold nodded. "I spoke today as if your judgment didn't matter, as if I still had the right to decide what was best for your life." Richard crossed his arms, not defensively, but thoughtfully. "I know you meant to protect me," he said. "Yes," Harold replied, "but protection isn't the same as respect." That was a good line. Not perfect, but honest.
"I should have trusted you," Harold continued, "and I should have respected the woman you chose without requiring her to prove herself to me." Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That would have made today a lot easier." Harold gave a small, rueful nod. "Yes, it would have." The three of us stood there together in a kind of stillness that felt new, not tense, not fragile, just unfamiliar, like a room that had been rearranged after many years and was still settling into its new shape. Finally, Harold looked at me. "I won't pretend I can undo what I did," he said, "but I meant what I said earlier. I would like the chance to do better." I held his gaze. "You'll have that chance," I said. He nodded, accepting that it was not forgiveness, but it was not rejection either, and sometimes that's where real change begins. Later that night, after everything had been cleared and the staff had gone, Richard and I returned to my house by the water. It was quiet again, the kind of quiet I had always loved. He loosened his tie and sat down at the kitchen table, exhaling deeply. "Well," he said, "that wasn't the wedding I expected." "No," I agreed, "it wasn't." He looked at me, a small smile forming. "But I think it might have been the one we needed." I leaned against the counter, considering that. "Yes," I said, "I think you're right." He rested his arms on the table. "So," he said, "are there any other surprises I should know about?" I smiled. "No more ranks," I said. "That's a relief," he replied. Then, more gently, "But I'd still like to hear about your life, when you're ready." I walked over and sat across from him. "I am ready," I said, and for the first time since we met, I began to tell him.
Not everything, not all at once, but enough. About the years of service, about the decisions, about the people I had led and the ones I had lost. He listened without interruption, without judgment, without trying to place it into some category he could control, just listening. And that, more than anything, told me I had made the right choice. As the night deepened and the conversation slowed, I stepped out onto my porch one last time. The water was dark and still now. The air carried that familiar coastal chill. I rested my hands on the railing and thought about everything that had happened. The insult, the silence, the salute, the apology, the shift. It would be easy to call it justice, easy to frame it as a moment where truth prevailed and pride was humbled, but life is rarely that simple. What mattered more wasn't that Harold had been proven wrong, it was that he had been given the chance to see it and choose something better. Because in the end, titles fade, positions end, even the strongest reputations soften with time, but character? Character is what remains when everything else is stripped away. I turned back toward the house, where Richard waited inside. A new chapter, not perfect, but real. And if there's anything worth carrying forward from a day like that, it's this. Treat people with respect before you know their story, not after, because by the time you discover who they are, it may already be too late to show them who you are. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of a moment in your own life where patience mattered more than pride, or where understanding came later than it should have, then take a moment to reflect on it. Share it with someone who might need that reminder. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about life, dignity, and the quiet strength we carry, consider subscribing and staying with us, because sometimes the most powerful lessons are the ones we don't see coming.